We hear politicians and central bankers preach about the benefits of economic growth and the steady rise in GDP figures. This is a highly coveted figure for measuring the economic success of a nation. It's long used and seldom contested. However, what exactly does this mean? Why do we continue to use this metric to govern our entire fiscal policy? Well, in this video, we'll take a good look at this concept and why GDP figures and the concept of growth in most modern economies is just plain meaningless. First off, all GDP figures mean is simply a measure of all the goods and services rendered in an economy in the course of a year. As you can imagine, this barely scratches the surface in regards to the complexities of human society and pays no attention to exactly what the goods and services are and who are the main beneficiaries of this economic growth. For example, imagine a population of 100 people and suddenly half of them develop cancer. Technically speaking, the GDP would explode as people dig into their savings to spend everything they have to fight this illness. This is obviously a horrendous form of economic activity, but this is exactly the problem with GDP. It gives no attention to what the source of economic activity is. This is all fine and well when the economic activity is from productive sources like restaurants, retailers, manufacturers, and service providers. But is this really something to cheer when most of the GDP increases come from skyrocketing housing prices, record bank profits, and higher prices for consumer goods simply because of inflation? Take this for example. If the big six banks double their fees overnight, technically speaking, we would have a nice bump in GDP figures. But of course, this in no way makes anyone richer, except of course the banks and their shareholders, which leads to the second issue. Using GDP as any sort of measure for economic success is simply incorrect. Where does GDP growth go to? When we see a 2% increase in GDP, yet stagnant wage growth, what can we estimate from this diversion in the economy? Well, as we can see in this graph, that economic output looks pretty promising. However, for the average person, the picture is much more stark, as the true economic outlook is much more dark. Here's the unemployment rates for the country, a very positive and often touted economic metric. However, we'll quickly see how little this actually means in the real world. Let's look at the Canadian GDP versus real world income growth for the 90% of Canadians who earn their income through wages and salaries. Essentially, most Canadians, all of the middle class and working poor classes, with only 10% of Canadians being left out of this figure, we can see as Canadians, we have actually little to no increase in economic growth for most of the population, all while the economy continues to grow. So the question is, where did all this economic growth go to? Who is the benefit of this growing economy? Well, the top 10% who has single-handedly taken 90% of all real income gains in this entire country, mainly through increased corporate profits, dividends, and capital gains, which are disproportionately owned by the top 10% of households in Canada, as well as being able to skirt much of the penalizing taxes levied on most Canadians. But how did this happen? And how is this done? Of course, people aren't forced with a gun to their head to accept lower wages for the same work as their parents did just a generation ago. And referring to government policies and labeling this as class warfare simply creates anger with no viable understanding of the true causes of this economic imbalance. Simply put, the productivity of the average person has skyrocketed, but the various policies and economic forces that have kept wages down and stagnant are to the benefit of corporations and their shareholders. And we can't completely blame the corporations in this, as technology advances and consumers expect lower prices, better service, and more innovative products. Something in this equation must take a loss in order to balance this equation. As corporations desperately struggle to produce growth in profits, stocks, and increased dividends year after year, regardless of the real-world impact of such short-sighted economic outlooks. This brings us to the ultimate problem with most GDP figures, the lie of modern growth. You see, as societies become more technologically advanced and education rates increase along with the rise of skilled labor, people tend to have less children and saturate themselves with every possible product and consumption item their income can support. Of course, people don't steadily increase how much food they eat or how much coffee they drink or even how many cars they buy as time goes on. This will simply be insane, especially as vehicles become more efficient, consumer goods use less materials and electricity, and generally last longer, with the exception being electronics. not to mention the increasing advancement of automation and the race to the bottom prevalent amongst most corporations, laying off workers and cutting costs at all levels in order to boost profits and short-term shareholder benefit. Multiply this across thousands of companies and you can see exactly what this means for economic output. However, it's not all gloomy, as economic growth is a real and very beneficial thing for many poor countries rising out of poverty. Through education and training to produce value-added goods, such as China, where raw materials are converted into finished products, thus allowing millions of new workers to earn money and wages they never otherwise would have. This pushes trillions from exports into the economy that simply wasn't there before. Once wages rise and consumer goods become affordable to the masses, people start to buy cars, TVs, houses, and electronics, spending on products they simply did not have before, as well as having families and birthing millions of new citizens. This is true economic growth, and we can see this prevalent in China's exploding GDP figures. However, as you can imagine, this isn't happening here, as simply put, everyone has all the trappings of a middle-class lifestyle, already saturated with most of the things they could ever want to buy. We have less children as education rates rise, and higher skilled work requires more training and more education time to become viable. Combine this with the continuous onslaught of automation, and we can easily see that efficiency is the enemy of economic activity. If today all taxis and trucks were replaced with self-driving ones, there would simply be a temporary boom in spending, but the long-term effects will be much more damaging to the economy, as millions of paychecks stop being sent and millions of dollars stop being spent into the economy, as thousands and thousands of dollars that would have been spent by each individual worker are simply collected into the pockets of consumers and companies, which exposes the final problem. Money that isn't spent might as well not exist in terms of economic activity. Imagine a country where everyone is a millionaire but no one needs to purchase anything, as they already have the trappings of a luxury lifestyle. Technically speaking, the GDP would be zero, because economic activity measures trade, not wealth. No trading means no GDP. As this trend continues, we will see a dividing division between what people think of the economy and what is actually occurring. This creates cognitive dissonance as people earn less and struggle to pay bills and genuinely dislike their living condition, subservient to jobs that are demeaning and downright soul-deadening. Despite living in one of the richest and safest countries in the world, it forces the average person to internalize their economic condition as a failure on their part rather than something inherently wrong with the system and how we measure economic success or even the happiness it's supposed to bring. Telling people that their economy is doing well while their wages, when adjusted for inflation, are actually decreasing, all while prices are increasing and expected to compete in an ever more fiercer and fiercer job market that may soon render them obsolete altogether. As much as positive thought helps in life, we need to know when positivity is really masking a serious under-discussed issue that will simply at some point in the near future render the society dysfunctional, as we continue to praise a higher number on some report on a bureaucrat's desk, all while people of all classes continue to diverge into groups of haves and have-nots. We as human beings who share the same biology, cultural identity, and share the desire to live a rich and fulfilling life, only to arbitrarily be pitted against one another, whether by birth or by success, on either side of a growing inequality, and an ever more stark contrast between these two groups, who either label each other a socialist or a greedy capitalist, stifling any real solution to form a society where the human condition is understood, our fears, our wants, our desires, and our hopes are taken into account to form a system that would not simply put us in position of having to tell generations to come, generations that are not locked into cognitive alleys of thought that most people often take when preaching the benefits of either socialism, capitalism, or even fascism. We need to comprehend, possibly, just maybe, there's something more to the success of mankind than just how much trade and exchange occurs in a 12-month span. Surely we can think of our societies and species in more constructs than just figures and numbers, or even ideological and political views, and form a much happier and better place for future generations to come.